Elena Gajotto, ich begrüße Sie ganz herzlich hier im Plenum. Sie sprechen gleich unsere nächste Keynote. Ich muss hier meinen Text rübernehmen. Frau Gajotto ist Vizepräsidentin und Projektmanagerin bei Una Casa per l'Uomo. Sie entwirft und leitet Projekte zum Thema Gewalt gegen Frauen, die sich sowohl auf die Unterstützung von Überlebenden als auch auf die Behandlung von TäterInnen konzentrieren. Im Rahmen von DeStalk koordinierte sie als Projektleiterin die Maßnahmen zum Kapazitätsaufbau von Fachleuten und zur Entwicklung einer Kommunikationskampagne über digitale Gewalt. Elena Gajotto ist auch Projektbeauftragte beim Work with Perpetrators Network. Liebe Frau Gajotto, we're looking forward to listen to you. It's your time now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for introducing me, and thank you for having me here to talk about the DeStalk project, which I'm very fond about. Let me start my presentation. Okay, so the DeStalk project unfortunately finished in January. It's a project that started 2 years ago, and we wrote it during the pandemic, and it's a project funded by the European Union. And as you can see here, the consortium was made up of very different partners with different expertise, each bringing a different perspective and point of view to the discussion about cyber violence. And the coordinator of the project was my colleague Berta, who just spoke about consent. It's important to mention that we had an important advisory board made of the Coalition Against Stalkerware, which is an international network of IT experts and professionals organizations working to support victims and to work with perpetrators. We had the Italian police, and we had the Italian network of victim support services. So the goal of the DeStalk project was to raise awareness and build, capacity building actions to help professionals and stakeholders recognize and hinder the use of cyber violence and stalker as new, and I lived there, new, widespread and hidden form of gender-based violence. As you know, when it was new, the topic was very new when we wrote the project in 2020, and it has since that moment it has become a very important topic, and it's one of the main focus on also European policies. So when we decided to go on with the project, we had three main actions in mind. The first one was the setting up of an e-learning course for public officials and professionals that work both with victims and perpetrators to train them on the issues of cyber violence and stalkerware. The second action was a capacity building action for professionals of NGOs and civil society organizations that every day work to support victims or to treat perpetrators. And we wanted to do this through toolkits to work on the topic, and through training workshop specifically dedicated to cyber violence. The last action that we had in mind was the development of a local communication campaign on the topic, involving both NGOs and institutions on this. And we see that what we had in mind slightly changed during the project. So one thing that I want to point out that for me is important is that, as you have seen from the composition of the partnership, the approach that we had through the DeStalk project was multidisciplinary, because we tackled the topic of digital violence through different perspectives and on different levels. It's also multi-agency, and as you have seen, I mentioned many times both victims and perpetrators, because you will see that all the actions and the outputs of the project take into consideration both the work with victims and survivors, and the work with perpetrators, because we firmly believe that, you know, in order to prevent and combat gender-based violence, we have to focus both on supporting the victims, but also on the work on perpetrators to stop them from acting violence again. So all the actions you will see are you know, targeted at both victims and perpetrators. The last thing is that we decided to use a very practical approach to the project. We decided to go with a bottom-up approach to tackle the needs of the professionals that every day work with victims or with perpetrators, to help them put into practice a more effective way to work specifically on this topic. As you know, digital violence is a very complex phenomenon, and it is a phenomenon which is, you know, kind of violence that is made of different forms of violence, like, for example, cyber-stalking. We have non-consensual sharing of images, limitation of tech access, cyber harassment, and so on. And all these forms have sub-forms in them. So it's a very complex phenomenon to work with. On the same line, we had, you know, when we started, we had to face many challenges, because when we started in 2021, for example, we had no common EU framework to work with. We had no definition, we had no legal framework. And as this, you know, we had, for example, the Grevio recommendation on digital violence. We had the proposal for the directive of the EU Commission on cyber violence that, you know, specifically mentions digital violence as one of the forms of cyber violence that needs to be tackled alongside with sexual violence and physical violence and so on. We have seen that cyber violence has many forms, but it can have many types of perpetrators that can be known or unknown to the victim. It can be perpetrated through different platforms and with different devices. So as you see here, the phenomenon is very complicated. So for this, like I said, we decided to start from the bottom. We decided to start with a needs assessment, and we had two focus groups, one across Europe and one in Italy, and one survey where we asked professionals that work with victims or perpetrators what they knew about cyber violence and what needs they had. And one thing that came up is that less than 50% of participants to our focus groups knew about forms of cyber violence. They mainly knew about the forms of cyber violence that are most talked on television, on newspapers, but they had a little knowledge about other forms like doxing or cripshot or spoofing, or all of these kinds of forms. And also we found out that only 20% of the professionals were trained to the work on cyber violence, and only 6 had specific procedures to work on this. So we started our journey through the project from this knowledge. And the first actions that we did were the capacity building and training actions. So the first thing was the goal that we had in the project was to adapt existing tools that are used in everyday practice of both services to include cyber violence in these tools. And we soon realized that the materials used by perpetrators programs and victim support services almost never mentioned cyber violence. It was not included as a standalone category of violence. It was not included in case studies or in examples. For example, we realized that when tools talking about control, we're just mentioning control as physical control or the control of relationships, but never mentioned as digital control, the control of devices or connections. And also, cyber violence was not included in risk assessment tools that tackle all the other forms of violence, but not this one. So we adapted the tools, the first thing, but that we were left with many questions and needs that were unanswered. So first of all, as you can see here, the blue ones are common between the two kinds of services. The first thing that we realize is that if we want a multi-agency approach to gender-based violence and to digital violence, we need to have shared definitions, and we need to speak the same languages between the two services so that can understand each other. And we also realized that we needed to have a better understanding on the laws that can be applied to cyber violence, because this was generating a big confusion among professionals. On the perpetrator side, that you can see here on the left, professionals were mentioning that they wanted to be able to recognize the warning signs, things that, red flags that can alert them that their man might be working with a perpetrator of digital violence. And at the same time, they were asking, how can we tackle this topic with the perpetrators that we see in our practice? On the victim support services side, the professionals, the advocates working with victims and survivors were telling us that they wanted to know how they needed a tool to assess cyber violence in the practice, and then how to tackle it. And then they expressed the need for a tool to be able to empower women and survivors, to give them safety tips on how to increase their safety. And then we realized that these safety tips were not just for survivors of violence, but were for us and for every woman in general. And at the same time, professionals were saying that they needed to be able to recognize warning signs on what the woman was telling. So starting from these needs, we built the DeStalk toolkits. It's 2 toolkits, one dedicated to the work with perpetrators and one dedicated to the work with the victim survivors. And the toolkit includes all of these tools that I'm going to show you now very quickly, because I don't have much time to do this. Just to mention that, we didn't build all of this by ourselves, but we relied on the research and the experience of both, institutional materials from the EU, but also from the work of networks that work specifically on the prevention and combat of gender-based violence in this topic. So the first tool that is included in the toolkit is a glossary of definitions related to digital violence. And as you can see here, we have a list. We have general definition of the phenomenon, but we talk about cyber stalking and subforms, cyber harassment, non-consensual sharing of images, the limiting attack access, and other forms. And they are all defined accurately in this tool that is common. It is the only tool that is common between perpetrators and victims toolkits. The second tool that we included in the toolkit for providers working with victim survivors is a what to do guide for the professional that every day see women in their practice. And it's based on, it gives tips on how to deal with all this phenomenon. And it has, an accurate guide on how to carry out the assessment of digital violence in all of its forms, not just cyber stalking, but all of its forms. It has all the instructions on how to safety plan, because it's important that in the practice we include IT safety planning in the ordinary safety planning that we do every day in practices. That includes safety measures on how to detect stalkerware, what to do in case we suspect that the victim might be under control or victim of a digital violence, but also what to do in case we are certain that there is cyber stalking involved. We also have indications on what to do about non-consensual sharing of images and information about content removal from the internet. And this is, it was mentioned this morning that this is, and it's an endless task of deleting images. That's the exact words that were said this morning about this. So we included information for providers about all of these topics. And you can see here all the chapters that were included. We also included tips, safety tips for survivors that are living with their abusers. And these are tips on how to increase their safety online, how to use a safe device, and so on. And then, as I was saying, we realized that it's not just survivors that need to know how to be safe online, but it's us as women in general that need a bit more information about this. So we created this guide. It's called Safe Online. It's a practical guide for women free from digital violence. And it has information on what digital violence is. And as you can see here, we talk about all the forms of digital violence. But then we also give tips and suggestions on how to protect ourselves online, but also where to turn to in case we suspect that we are under control or that our pictures have been leaked online, etc. The last tool that is included in the toolkit for providers working with victim survivors is the most particular one, and it's a checklist of red flags or warning signs that are indicate possible case of digital violence. And we decided to divide all these warning signs into 4 categories. The first one is warning signs related to technical aspects of devices. Like, for example, when the phone starts to function in a weird way that was not anticipated. Then we have warning signs related to the use of apps or devices. We have warning signs related to the behavior of the perpetrator, or warning signs about social media. As you can see here in the checklist, we have the list of red flags. Then we have the danger that is associated to that red flag. So that is why we need to pay attention to that particular aspect. We listed the form of cyber violence that might be included, might be involved, and then what we can do to solve the problem, to tackle it. This was a checklist that started with just a few items, and then with thanks to the work of my colleagues that every day work with survivors, the list grew, and we have 4 pages of warning signs. And this has proven to be very practical because it can be used with survivors to do the digital violence assessment. In the toolkit for the work with the perpetrators, we included, as you may or may not know, one of the aspects of the work with perpetrators is group sessions. So we included 1 group session dedicated specifically to cyber violence. And for this is one of the pages here, and it includes the general goals of the work. It includes case studies and stories that can be actually, used in the discussion with perpetrators. And it includes activities and exercises to help perpetrators reflect on the impact on the actions that they have on victims. And as we did with the toolkit for victims, we also did a checklist of red flags here that can be used in the work with perpetrators. And here I have a very important warning that when we work with perpetrators, we need to be very careful when we talk about cyber violence, because we do not want to give them too many details on things that they don't know about. We don't want to teach perpetrators who don't know about stalkerware, what stalkerware is and how to install it. So we need to be very careful, and in individual interviews, we cannot approach the subject directly. So we devised the red flags of things that the perpetrator might say during the interview, and then should ring a bell in the professional's mind to that might be a sign of digital violence. And as you can see here, we have these red flags with actual short sentences and things the perpetrator might say. We included the form of cyber violence that might be involved, but also we decided to include a list of possible questions that can help us as counselors and psychologists and so on. We can help us dig a little bit deeper into the matter to see if it's if we are dealing, in fact, with a case of digital violence. And again, you can see here that this checklist has a very practical approach. It can be used in the work with perpetrators. And like the checklist before, this shouldn't be considered as a list to go through. We shouldn't go through every item here, but it should be used as a mental map for providers to keep in mind that there is a lot of elements about digital violence that we need to keep in mind when working on this. So I should maybe run a little bit more. So after we prepared all the toolkits, we had to start working on the trainings. And given the complexity of what I've just said, we had many questions on how to carry on the training. Because as you have seen, digital violence is a topic that involves not just gender-based violence, but it involves tech aspects and legal aspects and psychological aspects, and then all the aspects related to the practice. So we devised 2 types of trainings, a long and a short training. And the longest, you can see here, these are all the topics that we tackled during the training. And as you can see here, when working on digital violence and training professionals on digital violence, we have to be very careful and talk about a lot of aspects that go from the identification of all the forms of digital violence we talked about digital security and how to increase protection against digital and online abuses. And we've done this with an IT forensic expert. We talked about all the legal aspects of cyber violence, so the crimes that are involved and the means of protection according to the law. But we also talked about the effects of cyber violence on survivors, the work with survivors, so through the assessment and the safety planning. We talked about the work with perpetrators, about motivation, intent, and behavior. We talked about coercive control and so on. And then we presented the DeStalk toolkit, and then we have practical sessions with case studies. So talking about digital violence can be overwhelming also for professionals, because as you know, when we talk about, for example, cyber stalking, or the pictures that are posted online that can never be, canceled. It's hard to cancel. It gives the idea that we are every day, every moment, we are under control, that somebody might be controlling us, and we, in fact, are losing control of our privacy and our lives. So it can be overwhelming. And then many professionals that are super expert of gender-based violence are not tech experts, and they are not tech savvy. So they are scared about the work on this topic, because they feel that they will not be able to tackle cyber violence because they do not know technology. So we needed to be very careful in balancing these 2 aspects. So on one side, we focused our training on an empowering aspects. So to give instruments both to the professionals, but also to give instruments to the women, to the survivors, on how to overcome all of this. And on the other side, during the training, we did a lot of live demos and practical demonstrations to teach professionals on how to use the tools that they have, on how to monitor their security and to control, for example, the survivors' phones to see if they're stalk aware or other risks involved. So yes, the training has received many positive, we tested it both in Italy and across Europe, and it has been really interesting to see, the reaction of the professionals that were involved. So alongside with the training, we also designed and published an e-learning course on digital violence. that you can see here. The course, the e-learning course is still open and available. So after you can use the link if you want, you can take it. And it's a training based on 4 different levels that are increasing in difficulty and technicity. And as you can see here, we go from gender-based cyber violence to the forms of cyber violence and stalker and so on. And the e-learning course is available in 5 languages. So it's available in English, French, German, Italian, and Spanish. And it's designed into a micro-learning approach. So it's a course that you can take on your own time, even when you are riding the train or commuting. It's all small bites, pieces of information that are easy to learn and to memorize, and can take you to increase your knowledge about all of these topics. So the training has had a lot of practical impacts and changes that professionals reported to us, and that especially because we all know that, and professionals know that cyber violence was important, but they were sort of scared to include it in their practice because they didn't know how to tackle it. So now we tried to give them tools to work on. So the last task of the DeStalk was the designing of a communication campaign on digital violence. And so we did this in 3 big steps and phases because we wanted the campaign not to be just organized by us as NGOs, but we wanted the campaign to have an institutional support. And that, the topic of digital violence, we believe that it should be incorporated into the public institution policies about gender-based violence. So the first phase regarded involvement of institutions, and was institutional work. We designed a protocol for a territorial campaign strategy involving the institutional the regional coordination table for the prevention and contrast to violence against women. And it was chaired by the regional minister for social services and health. And we managed to involve all the relevant stakeholders. So we had regional departments, but also we had schools, social services, health authorities, municipalities, police, research, and practitioners like us that all decided to collaborate together to carry out the communication campaign on this. We also, given, like I said, the fact that we firmly believe that the work on gender-based violence and digital violence should be targeted both at victims and perpetrators, we decided and we managed to involve in the campaign the 2 national networks, 2 Italian national networks, for the work with perpetrators and for the work with survivors.
Will you slowly come, not slowly, come to an end, because we have a few questions and not so much time anymore.
Okay, so, sorry, because I get carried away every time that I talk about this project. I'll try to be, quicker. So the second phase was the actual campaign on digital violence. And as we were mentioning before, one of the troubles that we have was we didn't want to teach possible perpetrators about forms of digital violence. So we had to be very careful in the way that we were constructing our work. So for this, we decided to have public events on national festivals. We had a lot of press work. We managed to publish more than 60 articles and interviews in both in papers and TV and radio. We did a press event and realized dedicated images and reels, video reels for this. The last part is that we developed, and I skip in, EU replication. We developed guidelines on how to carry on a campaign about digital violence. And as you can see, you can find it online. And we attached, you can find all the templates that we designed for the campaign and all the materials that we provided. Alongside with a lot of tips on what to do, what we should do, and what we should avoid when tackling this topic publicly. So, for example, one of the important things is that we need to give empowering messages. We should avoid, for example, depicting the picture of women as victims, and we should avoid picturing all men as monsters. So instead, we should promote, a more empowering and non-stereotyped image. And alongside with this, we should start using images that are empowering, not just like the ones that we have, that I attached here, that all depict a gloomy and sad image and the man like a hacker, but more like, the image of a man that is willing to seek help and change their behavior, and of women like, supporting each other and so on. You can read all of this in the guidelines. Do you have 1 other minute, or should I stop here?
I think you should stop.
Okay. So, okay. Just no. Sorry, I didn't want. Okay. So you can find all the materials in the website here. All the materials are published in English and Italian. They are freely available in the website. You can find a link or the QR code here, and you can download everything. So for any other information, here's my email. Yeah, sorry for running long.